Mini episode 1696 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1696. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris coming at you, and we have my good friend, FDH Lounge dignitary and FDH Lounge hoops analyst Ben Chu coming at you here today. And new year and a new Detroit Pistons vibe. Winning. They closed out 2023 with a win, but we are here to talk about everything that came before that, the historic NBA losing streak put up by the Detroit Pistons, something that we didn't expect to see coming into this season. Because, again, they were not overtly tanking in a way that teams would have been in past years. There's no Victor Wembanyama available in the draft in 2024. There's no overt reason to tank. We see a lot of the guys going up and down the draft board rankings next year. No reason in particular that you need to be number one, number two, or even number three as of right now. That reason might materialize down the road, but there's no reason that you would want to tank to be as bad as they are. And almost always, it's been teams that are tanking and basically playing the long game. Think about, what they did in Philadelphia over a long period of time there and how that all played out. But we're looking at something really different here in Detroit. We're looking at the accidental worst team in modern pro basketball. And that's a fascinating story. And we got to bring on our hoops analyst to talk about it, Ben Chu. Ben, great to have you on, buddy. Let's get into this dumpster fire of a story here with the Pistons, my man.
Yeah, it's something I don't think any of us really truly expected, to be honest.
No.
And we'll see, though, because technically, Rick, I do want to put this out there. They still are on a losing streak against all North American, USA, NBA teams still. Toronto is still Canadian, so.
That is a great point. How long is that losing streak going to go on? That's amazing.
Well, they have a game. Well, as whenever this is, we're recording on New Year's Day.
Yes.
So they have a game later tonight against Houston.
Okay.
So.
All right. So yes. So we'll see. There is going to be.
We'll see if they get to 2 wins.
Exactly.
We'll see if the winning streak starts here.
Okay. And by the time that this is online, everybody listening will know, as there will be a lag of about a day or so here. So people will know at that point in time whether the American losing streak has continued or whether it too has come to an end. And it is a situation here where we've talked about some things before, so I'm just, from my point of view, going to gloss over some of the points I've made previously, as far as that being with the Pistons, that, again, it seems to me that they are a dumpster fire for the modern NBA, this whole pace and space game of today, that a team like this, where you still have, you have guys that can slash, you have guys that can score in other ways outside of being good shooters, and that, again, maybe that could have been a 20 to 25 win team a decade or more ago, but today, where, again, if you don't have the spacing on the floor here, if you don't have legit threats, you are dead meat. This is a team that cannot afford to exist in today's NBA, and it would have been just like a bad team previously in the NBA. Not a historically bad team, just a bad team, a really bad team for that year as opposed to a bad team for all time. And then, of course, you made the point also previously, and I'm glad that you thought of it because I wouldn't have thought of it. And for as much as, again, when I criticize teams when they do the great man theory of history of like, we got to go get a name coach and win the press conference, of getting Monty Williams in there just because he was the last man standing as far as the name coaches last summer. That's one of those things where you pointed out, hey, in a rebuilding situation in New Orleans, not so great. In a situation where a team was set up to win in Phoenix, he did a really good job. He is situationally a really good coach. And this isn't a situation like that. You called it on that end. So you and I have already identified two reasons previously that this has gone the way that it's gone.
Right. And I think again, the jury's still out, in my opinion, about how good of a head coach Monty Williams is. Is that because he had great success with the Phoenix Suns, got them to within 2 wins of an NBA championship. But one of the main complaints I've read about from Pistons fans and media analysts there is that his rotations during the season seemed very baffling. He played 2 bigs for most of the season, and Weissman and Isaiah Stewart, which they both have potential to hit threes, but they've never surpassed 35% in their career from the arc. So the rotations didn't really work. He kind of favors certain guys. He did the same thing, too, with Phoenix, with some of the rotations they had during the finals, that they maybe could have done some different things after Dario Saric went down that. He wasn't able to make adjustments at that point. But it feels like, to me, the jury's kind of out on Monty Williams. And the question is, and everyone has said, many analysts say he's a leader of men. He's someone who is capable of putting together great team camaraderie, great team chemistry. But the question is during this long losing streak, it appeared to me that he wasn't able to reach some of these younger players to try and have a little bit more sense of urgency to sort of end this streak at this time.
I can understand that. I think that's a very, very valid point.
And I'll interrupt you for a quick second, too,
yeah.
Rick. There's also a discussion, too, that, again, Monty had balked at this job prior. And not until they offered him the contract, that's when he essentially came around to the deal. So.
Well, and it's funny, too, because it's sort of, and maybe a little bit of a cautionary tale for what I would have wanted back in the day, way long ago, not long after the Cleveland Browns came back into the NFL. I remember saying the whole thing of like, and this is back when this would have been a lot of money for a head coach in the early 2000s. You fly down to Key West, you put a suitcase with $50 million in gold bullion in Jimmy Johnson's lap, and you make him say no. And again, so maybe that wouldn't have worked out anyways, but that's sort of what the Pistons did here. 20-some years later, they took the Rick Morris theory of we're just going to throw enough money at this guy until he says yes. So I didn't know all the particulars of that until you just said it now. And that's one of those things where, again, that will be reason to kick themselves on a historic level if it actually played out.
The question, too, and I think this was brought up during this losing streak, was this more of a Troy Weaver decision, the Pistons GM, or was this more of a Tom Morris decision, the Pistons owner?
Yeah. Well,
and that always is going to be an interesting thing. And we all know this. I think there's a share of blame to go around with everyone, honestly, because at periods of time we can say that, I feel like perceptionally a losing streak this long is usually put on the head coach, and I'm going to give Monty a little bit of less flack here, is that Troy Weaver hasn't done the best job of picking the players that fit that team. It kind of reminds me a little bit when like the early mid-90s Vancouver Grizzlies were a thing, and they were trying to build under Stu Jackson, who arguably did one of the worst jobs in NBA history of putting together a franchise. But it just feels like during Weaver's time, he was exalted. He was part of the OKC team under Sam Presti. So I think logistically at the time, everyone thought that was a great decision. But it just kind of feels like that the Pistons were doing a lot what the Sacramento Kings did in the 2010s, which is they were acquiring top talent, but not really doing a great job of assessing essentially how this talent fits with the overall roster.
Well, and I have sort of a sub-theory of the case of what you said there. I'm going to circle around to that in a moment because I want to get into a little bit of a follow-up on something you mentioned a couple minutes ago, which is you were talking about, I believe, a lineup combination with James Weissman and Isaiah Stewart. Yes? I believe that was what you mentioned?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So this is one of those things where I went on to Basketball Reference in preparation for this discussion. One of the things that moderately surprised me, because, again, my overall critique of Detroit is that, again, their spacing is so friggin' putrid that's a big part of their issue. I'm looking at Isaiah Stewart and did not expect to see this. 398 three-point percentage as of the end of 2023 calendar year. And now that's only on 3.5 shots per game. Furthermore, I scanned down a little bit here. Marcus Sasser, 415, but again, only 2.8 shots per game from three-point land. So Am I oversimplifying if I look at this and I say part of the issue near term, anyways, to try to help turn things around is increase the volume on these guys? I know the percentage is going to go down. Do you think the percentage might plummet enough to where it wouldn't be worth pursuing?
I mean, it's a legitimate question to ask. And one of the critiques I had seen from like Pistons fans of Monty Williams' rotation during that the lengthy losing streak was he relied a lot on guys like Alec Burks and Isaiah Lively, and Bogdanovich came back late, but he is still currently right now the Pistons he is the highest 3-point taker on the Detroit Pistons at this current moment.
By far,
so,
yes.
I say there's a way that you can sort of average it up. And again, one of the questions too, Rick, is that Detroit is one of the teams in the league right now. Like the big hyper focus for a lot of these teams are 3-pointers and easy baskets. But if you look down the roster, they don't really have many guys outside of Cunningham and Ivy that can get easy baskets in the paint. And one argument you can even make of Cadiz is that he's currently not ranked in the top 50 of field goal percentage in the restricted area. So
yeah, that's a good point, and you would have expected him to be that, all things being equal with everything that's around him, and as far if the spacing certainly were better, that would help a little bit. But when you look at this, and again, Ivy has been certainly very disappointing through the course of his career, and a 312 3-point percentage as of this time of recording. That ain't helping matters any right there. He has not turned out to be the kind of player, certainly thus far, that I thought he was going to be. But this is a thing where when you look at this roster, this is one of my theories also here too. And you mentioned Alec Burks a second ago here. He's a guy that when the Cavs were still really bad, like right before they turned the corner, and I think he might have been here when the Cavs were starting to turn the corner back in 2021. I don't remember exactly, but he was a guy that was, relatively popular, at least in hipster circles in Cleveland, because he's a stabilizer, it seems like. So I understand trying to get him minutes, because he's a guy where, again, for somebody that was a lottery pick when he came out, he never became that guy. And I'll make this point before I ask you the other question I was going to ask you, but Alec Burks is the kind of guy where you need to have somebody like him on a really bad team, don't you? Because he's a veteran and, like I said, a stabilizer and somebody that can help, I think, steady some of the younger players there, because it's a super young team, Bogdanovic aside.
Right, and I think you do. And there was, I would feel like, again, most people who were Pistons fans during that losing streak, they had complaints that Monty was playing Alex Burks way too much when he could have been giving more time to Ivy. And then we also have to go into the entire timeline of the Killian Hayes saga for Monty Williams, which is still giving Killian Hayes minutes instead of Jaden Ivey, which caused a lot of confusion for a lot of Pistons fans overall. So
yeah,
it's just one of those things, like, it's a hodgepodge of guys. There's a lot of talent, I would argue, on this roster. There's at least, unless I'm mistaken, 4 lottery picks on this roster now.
At least.
It just, the problem is that 3 out of the 4 lottery picks are not consistent at all at making 3-point shots. And in today's world, in today's NBA, if you just sort of look at how the game is played, if you're not making your 3-pointers, you're not winning in the NBA. And during a stat that I saw, it was a courtesy of Instagram, Effects, a data visualization company on Instagram. They essentially they mapped out how many missed 3-pointers that Detroit made during that losing streak. And they missed nearly 600 of them.
Wow.
Nearly 600 threes. And we know how, volatile today's NBA is in terms of teams winning and losing. And again, I'm going to note, and I'm going to be honest when I say this, I do think this losing streak is somewhat of a statistical anomaly. The Pistons were in at least 6 games where they were within 2 possessions or less of winning, and I think they led in going into the fourth quarter in 10 of the 28 games they played.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of an anomaly, but it's also sort of a cautionary tale of how pace and space exists in today's modern NBA. And that if you're not able to make 3-point shots and make them with any consistency, it's not great. I'll use a quick data point. During the tail end of the run, they were the worst 3-point shooting team in the NBA, and Dallas was the best 3-point shooting team. And just on averages of total 3-pointers made per game, Dallas was on average scoring 14 points more, roughly around 14 points more than Detroit was. So anyone with a brain can tell you, if you're a 14 points is in most cases the difference between winning and losing an NBA game.
Of course, yeah. I mean, that is
in most cases.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of a startling statistic right there. But in looking at this roster, and this is a thing where, and I'm wondering if I have to sort of question one of my long-held assumptions about the NBA, because again, the team that I am most aware of in depth is also the team that I am most passionate about as a fan, my hometown Cleveland Cavaliers. And so a lot of times, and particularly teams in division, I tend to look at them in relation to the Cavs. And I remember like a couple of years ago, like I thought, oh, you know, Cade and Ivy, like, oh, this is a team the Cavs are going to have to look out for in the future. I also thought that about Indiana. I was right about Indiana. I was wrong about Detroit. But in looking at this roster, and you know from discussions about the Cavs on and off air, how much of a believer I am in vacuuming up as much potential and as high pedigree guys, whether they're not at that point now or whether they are, they're usually available if they're not at that point of realizing their pedigree. But I'm starting to believe in looking at the Detroit roster that there has to be a cap on the number of guys you have that are reclamation projects. As I'm looking at this here, we could quibble on whether Bagley is one of those guys or not. You said all along you thought that he was a high floor, low ceiling guy to go in that spot. So I don't know that let's start with him before I get into the other points here. Bagley kind of like, I think you would probably make the argument even at age 24, like he is what he is, right? He's not necessarily a targeted...
He still has potential to be a great long-term rotational player in the NBA. My concern with him coming out of Duke was he was not consistent at outside shooting.
Yeah. And
essentially he's a little undersized, he's a bit of a tweener, and at that time when there was the arguments at that time for like, there were the argument again to go back to another team who had a very questionable history, the Sacramento Kings, was it just kind of felt like there were other guys they could have taken. Like you can bypass the Luka and Trae Young stuff. Say you don't want to. Like Jaren Jackson was probably a better fit for that roster. It just kind of feels like to me that Marvin Bagley is a guy who has the ability to finish around the basket. He's a good rebounder. It just feels like he's one of these guys that, like, I mean, Bill Simmons would use the analogy. It's just wrong time, wrong place. And Marvin Bagley, I think in the 80s or 90s NBA would be a really solid NBA starter. But in today's NBA, if you can't really consistently shoot the three, you're just not going to be an impact player.
Yeah, so I'm going to leave Bagley out of my critique for that reason because I think he's never going to be the guy that they thought Sacramento thought he was going to be when he came out. So he's not a guy where it's like, maybe he can still be a superstar. I don't think anybody's thinking about that about Bagley anymore. But I'm talking about guys that had that kind of really, really, really high gloss pedigree on them. By the way, Sacramento, and we've talked about this on the show previously, before they turned it around in the last couple of years, they were always the poster child for, we would talk about this, like really bad roster construction as far as like, you would pick a guy without any kind of regard to who you'd taken the year before or the year before that. If you're duplicating a position, hey, tough toenails, then they'll just fight it out for that spot and we'll still leave, 3 or 4 holes in the starting rotation as opposed to trying to fill holes. And you look at this here and you see that backcourt. You got Cade in the one spot. You got Ivy and Hayes. So, again, roster fit and construction, that's part of the deal here. But my theory on where I think I might have been wrong about upside, and that I think you have to cap chasing the upside at a certain point, is I'm really coming around to the belief that you can only have so many potential reclamation projects on one roster, especially if you're a bad team, especially if your chemistry is just the drizzling shiznits as it is on this team. Because you're looking at guys, you bring in Wiseman, who's the very personification of a guy trying to get it back. Second pick in the draft. Everybody thought he could be a potential franchise player. He started off really nice with Detroit, but that didn't last long. Kevin Knox is here. That's a guy that flamed out in New York that never really became anything there. You got a couple guys on your own roster that have been failures to this point. Let's just say it. Killian Hayes has been a big failure. Jaden Ivey has been, I will say, not a capital F failure, but a lowercase f failure. He's only 21. there's still time. But like, I'm looking at this roster and I'm looking at all these guys chasing this whole thing of what they were supposed to be. And I just wonder if you don't want like one or two less of those guys on your roster. And even if you're selling low, maybe to move one or two of these guys just so that, again, hopefully your chemistry is a little better and maybe you have less guys that are so desperately trying to make it happen for themselves and more guys that kind of fit into the whole picture of things, like Alec Burks, who long ago I think accepted his place in the universe.
Right, and I think to even go back to Marvin Bagley really quickly is that the Detroit's only error seems like they gave him an extension on his contract.
Yeah.
Because of his prior success over the last season. And again, this may be a cautionary tale that just because one guy has one good season doesn't necessarily mean you need to extend him unless you really think he is a high quality rotational player in the NBA.
Right.
But at the same point, just to go back to what you're saying, it's like, I've always personally thought that team chemistry can be a bit of a misnomer, in my opinion, because I've seen enough instances in NBA history where guys who just hate each other can still win a title together.
Right.
And it's more that if you're trying to go after reclaimed talent, you can only do so much because there's a reason why it's reclaimed talent at the end of it.
Yes.
So you can only do what you can. And I feel like, too, is that to be also fair to Detroit, I think they've tried their best to do. I mean, the one person that we've kind of left out of this entire conversation was Monte Morris, who was essentially signed in the offseason.
Yes.
Who has been injured for most of this run. Now, the question is, I don't think, as we will discuss, Rick, I don't think Monte Morris is going to save this team, but a veteran guard from the tree of the Denver Nuggets, you would think a guy like that could have been a stabilizing factor during a epic long losing streak like this one.
You would think so. And, in terms of going back in Philadelphia, where they had that just really, really extended, brutal time, such that, again, the previous management didn't get a chance to see it through. I'm wondering in retrospect here, again, the fact that so many of their top picks were failed picks at that point in time. And that was happening too. Philly, I will say, in fairness to them, they were doing it at sort of the dawn of the pace and space revolution. Golden State, what they were imposing on the league, it was just sort of starting at that point. So with some of the guys that they took that didn't fit into it as well, you really would have needed a crystal ball back in, I think, 2015, 2016, 2017 to know what the way the whole league's going to go. But I'm just wondering because again, everybody always talked about how bad their chemistry was and just how god-awful everything was. I just wonder at that point in time if they weren't moving on from some of their failed picks a little bit too long, if they weren't hanging on to these guys too long. I'm not generally a proponent of selling low, so I'm kind of going against some of my own principles on saying this, but I get this feeling looking at this Detroit team that maybe one of the lessons to learn is you can only have so many reclamation picks on your roster at one point in time. If you want to have any kind of semblance of chemistry and any of those things that can help you win the games that could go either way. And Detroit has certainly lost way more than their share of games that could go either way along the way here. Sometimes they get blown out, but then sometimes there's nights like there was in Boston where they just couldn't close.
Yeah, and I think also the question too, Rick, is that in today's NBA, it's like you can have reclamation projects on your team, but the question I always wonder is, do you want the stink of that on your team?
Right.
And again, like there were many instances where a more stable roster would have won. Like the most notable game that I remember from the streak was the game where Giannis got tossed. Again, where they played Milwaukee, Giannis got tossed in the first half of the game.
Yep.
A good team would have won that game because there's no Middleton, no Giannis. It was pretty much Damian Lillard so early in the season trying to learn what was going on. So a good team would have won that game, or even an average NBA team would have won that game. And again, I point this a little bit on Monty because then, again, it comes down to the head coach and the decision-making he's making. But the players, again, have to be consistent. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they build around Cade, or if the stink of this is going to impact Cade a little bit in his career. It's going to be very interesting how they're drafting and roster construction is going to be over the next 12 to 14 months. Because we might see something we've never seen before, which is Cade could make the decision not to take the max and just go to another franchise where he feels a more stable situation. Or a rumor that I'll even throw this out there hypothetically, Rick, is if he decides not to sign the extension, he could go to another franchise who also has young talent that is looking for like a connector on offense. Because the one thing that I did notice late during the end of this run was Cade improved his efficiency around the basket and from three as well. So he is capable of being I believe long term he is the correct overall number one draft pick choice that Detroit made. That was correct. I think the big question ultimately is he one of those empty stats guys who can get 28, 8 and 8, but can't direct the franchise to win? Or is this more just he has nothing around him and he's just forced to do more work?
That's a good question. And for a guy that I was comparing a lot to Luka when he came out and basically saying, like, that ought to be his goal, that ought to be the team's goal, is that he can be a guy on that level and contribute in those ways. Certainly, they're built a lot the same way as far as being a big point guard capable guy and how they can distribute the ball, how they can run the offense, and how they can create their own offense. But this is a situation where, yeah, you're right, he may not see it through there in Detroit. And this is where, again, you and I have talked about a lot of different things here that one would hope NBA front offices are having the same discussions and using this as a cautionary tale for how they can keep this from ever happening. Because as I said at the outset, having a team this horrible without tanking, when numerous teams have outright tanked in recent years to get high draft picks, and this team is worse than any of them without coming into the season saying, let's see how bad we can possibly be. Again, hopefully teams are drawing lessons from this. And as far as, again, how you pull out of this thing here, I will say, wherever they're at in the draft lottery this year, and again, knowing their luck, they'll probably be picking fourth, right? And they have kind of underachieved a little bit with their draft position some of these years. But last year, taking Ausar Thompson, again, a guy who not a great shooter by any stretch of the imagination at this point in time, but they were so in love with his athleticism and everything else. And he's helped them in all the ways that they had a reason to expect that he would, while being the bad shooter that they also had a reason to expect that he would. And so he's not been able to help them pull out of this in any way, shape, or form. But it's a thing we're going into the draft this year. Again, I don't mean to oversimplify here, but it's a thing where when you're looking at that group of players that are right now presently in the conversation for number one or top five or whatever, I mean, if you're Detroit, you got to get the best shooter available, right? I mean, I think that there's no question about that they have to go do that, and they have to get somebody who, even if you don't like his, and again, I'm going against, because I'm normally in love with upside and everything like that, and even if you're talking about a guy who projects maybe more so as a, catch and shoot kind of a guy, but I mean, you got to get that spacing at all costs, do you not? Be it there or in free agency, and in free agency, unless you really overpay, who's going to want to go there?
Right, and I think this is, again, we discussed this in the past about the early 2000s, late 80s, early 90s Clippers and the issues that they had with having to deal with multiple losing seasons. And it feels like, too, the question ultimately is you have to go for more shooting, and you have to do the best that you can at this point in regards to that. But if you look at the top half of this draft, there's not a lot of great shooters. I think Mattis Berzelius, who was for a fair amount of time in the offseason the overall number one pick, has kind of been up and down during his G League Ignite season. So it's been very interesting to see where he'll go. I mean, the top two, at least projected at this point, would be Holland from G League Ignite, who's had a good overall season, but he isn't a great three-point shooter, and big man Alexander Sarr, who has good range outside, but he's, again, yet another big guy who kind of is one of those hybrid guys that you just don't know how he's going to play overall. So I don't think, to be very honest, Rick, I feel like the smart, logical move to do at this point is that they've had three, even though this is Monty's first year, they've had three sub-25 win seasons.
Yep.
The question I always am the individual who would rather blow the team up sooner than later. So the question I think you ultimately have to ask is, you're going to take someone high in the draft, hopefully you can have a reclamation season next season and get into the play-in tournament or into like the lower half of the conference playoffs, because as we know, the Eastern Conference is still very toss-up-y after the top 4 or 5 teams. So you're really just looking to try and set your own path and try to figure out who is probably, I think the biggest question then, Rick, is who is going to be Cade's best match in the draft, essentially. Because if you're building around him, you have to consider his skill set and what they can do overall.
That's true. And again, but getting somebody who can space the floor would be the biggest help that they could give him and everybody else on the roster. Again, assuming that such a player is available. And part of it is, again, they haven't had the best of luck in recent years as well as far as their draft slotting and everything. But again, their roster construction has been atrocious. And again, some of this is 20/20 hindsight. Because again, I liked Ivy at the time. I didn't have any particular qualms about Hayes at the time. I thought they were smart to try and acquire Wiseman at the time because, again, anybody that has that kind of upside and potential and whatever, but they've probably reached the point of cutting bait on him because you're not going to get any more opportunities with a team than he's getting in Detroit. Who's standing in his way, right? And he still can't get the job done. So it's a really, really tough situation for them. And again, a really interesting case study in the NBA. You and I have talked about this and really gotten to sink our teeth into, more so I would say over a period of time on the positive end. And you and I have done some segments that I know that we're really proud of in talking about this new player development era in the NBA, going back to 2020 when Denver and Miami first made the NBA Conference Finals. So we've been talking about this more so big picture on the positive end, but this is a conversation. I think this is a necessary bookend to that on the negative end, on mistakes that you can make with the construction of a franchise, the coaching of a franchise, and all these other things that can lead to you being in just the utter depths of despair that the Pistons are in right now.
Right. And I feel like we'll note this too, Rick, this is more just a cautionary tale more than anything else in my personal opinion.
It is.
And again, we'll note this too because I think one of the questions that even though the losing streak is over now, the Pistons are still within range right now, projected-wise, of being the worst team in NBA history.
Yep.
And how that, because people tend to get, well, okay, the losing streak was terrible, but people will forget about that, honestly. Like, it will go up on the list of, like, the worst. It'll go up there as a thing. We're all going to remember it. It's going to be terrible. But if this team ends up losing, with only winning 8 games in an 82-game season, beating the 72-73 Sixers, overall win total of only 9 wins, I think that's a stench that does follow players for a while.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to bring into the fact, how's this guy a winner? Because we judge a lot, especially in the NBA, on wins and losses. And it's going to be interesting to see because Detroit's either going to have to do a real quick turnaround really quick for all this to be forgotten. But if you look at sort of the history of the league of these teams who have had really terrible records, it takes them a long time just to get back to even relevancy. So we know this when we discussed this off air, is that this team, based on talent alone, should not have lost this many games in a row. And they're much more talented than the process 76ers, the LeBron-less Cavs, like the Grizzlies teams, the Denver Nugget team with Tony Battie in 97-98 that won only 11 games. This team has way more talent than ever. It's just that they're in a timeline in the NBA where if you can't make three-pointers, you're not winning games.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as a Cavs fan, I would have given my left nut for a player like Cade Cunningham on the 2010-2011 Cleveland Cavs. One thing I do want to go back to, Rick, and we'll note this, is that I do feel like this losing streak is an anomaly, to be brutally honest. It might be. I
think it's an anomaly just because it's the NBA, and it's the NBA, and then games. I think we're all mainly so shocked by this is because the NBA is so random now in comparison to prior years.
Yep.
That we didn't think it was possible that a team could lose because just by luck one night that they would get hot and make like 15 3-point shots.
Yeah.
And win. Now I think that goes against the only thing I guess we can say about that is that goes against that theory, Rick, that it's very possibly that a team cannot get hot in the NBA for a period of time. So if we go past like roster construction and the Pistons, I think one of the things that we can learn from this just as NBA fans is that it is possible to go on a lengthy winning streak, but it's also just as probable as to go on a lengthy losing streak at the same time.
Well, and that's another thing that's a product of these pace and space days, this era in the NBA, because a couple of years ago, I think not Danny, that's a Freudian slip there, Danny Ferry. Kevin Love. Kevin Love passed Mark Price for the all-time three-point record for the Cavs, and he pointed out correctly, Kevin Love's a very class individual. Hey, look, Mark Price, awesome at this, but like imagine if he was playing today. Imagine if he had a green light as much as I have a green light. Because like back then it would be a thing of like, oh, Mark Price has hit 6 3-pointers in a row. Well, time to ease off that a little bit, right? You don't want to shoot too many threes. Like players back then had it beaten into their heads. And you're right, today, man, if you're hot, keep jacking it up, baby. Keep jacking it up. You can hit 15 3-pointers in a period as a team if you're hot enough, right? If you're feeling it, because today you're supposed to chase that run. So in an area where you're supposed to chase that run when you get on one, of course it randomizes the game more. Of course it should give a team like Detroit a better chance of not having a long losing streak about this, because they might suck at three-point shooting relative to the other teams in the league, but they still got guys that can get hot and hit them. Cade's one of those guys, certainly. And that's a thing where, again, a little bit of karma here. I did see some old takes exposed on Twitter in recent days as far as some of the Piston fans laughing at the Cavs back in 2010, 2011. What goes around comes around on that one, as far as the Pistons being the team to surpass the Cavs for most consecutive losses. But this is one of those things where, again, you look at that and you look at where the Cavs were at that period of time, and it was the extreme stroke of luck trading with the hapless Clippers. The rest of the world tends to forget it was the Clippers' unprotected pick that allowed the Kyrie Irving selection in 2011. It wasn't the Cavs sucking it up as much as they did. They ended up being, I think, 4th, and that was the Tristan Thompson pick. The Clippers, I think it should have been the 7th pick if it all went according to record. On a fluke, it ends up being number 1. It goes to the Cavs. The Cavs get Irving, and that is the beginning of the turnaround that leads to LeBron coming to town, Kevin Love joining him, and the championship and the run of Eastern Conference Finals to come. So if Detroit is looking at that as far as any kind of thing of like, oh, well, look at how the Cavs turned it around after that. Yeah, you can't count on all of those things happening, and you don't have one of the top 2 players in NBA history that grew up in the Detroit area that 4 years from now is going to want to come back and play in Detroit once you've started to turn it around. The Cavs are in no way, shape, or form, the Cavs of that period of time, an example for what Detroit can hope for. They have a lot of things, as we've said, stacked up against them that are very formidable at this point, with the roster construction, the contracts, all the way on down, and potentially having to replace your general manager and your coach, which may be in the cards.
Right, and I mean, one thing we have to also discuss to use another famed team, the process 76ers, was they were essentially trying to just accumulate top flight picks.
Yep.
And essentially, they had multiple bites at the apple, and that multiple bites turned into Joel Embiid, who essentially right now is arguably the outside of Nikola Jokic, the best big man, and possibly this year a 2-time MVP candidate. So I think we sometimes tend to forget in the NBA, it's more about luck and acquiring the top talent to be on your roster more than anything else. And sometimes we fall in love with potential, we fall in love with ability, we fall in love with all these things, but then sometimes in life you just have to take a guy who could be the face of your franchise. And I do still believe that Cade Cunningham can do that. The problem is right now at his point of his career, he is still finding out his game and trying to figure out what he needs to do. I feel like this losing streak for him will be beneficial wherever he ends up in his NBA career. But it feels like, too, is like you don't want to see top talent get demoralized by losses. But at the end of the day, the question we always say, especially to go back just to the Pistons overall, is that there are ways out of this. The NBA is very quickly to adjust on the fly. And if they can get a top flight guy that fits with Cade, they can be right back into the discussion in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. And also, too, Rick, to go back to one minor point that I do want to bring up just in terms of like the prior point you made about Mark Price and Kevin Love. In terms of how the game has changed today, back to like the late 80s, early 90s, I'll use the analogy to go back to it. It was a stat that I heard, I believe J.J. Redick said it, to go back to like 1997 and to compare the three-pointers from today and then. Like Detroit, based on three-point attempts alone, would have been a top 5 three-point shooting team in the NBA in 1997.
Wow.
So the dramatic arc of how the league has changed is clearly that high. And I think we all have to also, it's something I know we've all talked about with like Golden State, with how they were building their team. Oklahoma City and Minnesota are right now great examples of how you can take guys with high level potential players and put the right guys around them. So I would say this for Pistons fans, hope is not lost, but I really hope for Cade's sake they do not become the worst team in NBA history.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good because there's not much historical reference as far as assessing players that have gone through something like that. Again, any of the really good players that were on the Cavs in 2010, 2011, their best days were all behind them. Kyrie wasn't yet on that team. There weren't any players that would go on to become stars that were on that team. So we don't have much of a grading expectation here for what's going to happen to Cade.
And I'll make this as a unique situation because all the worst teams in NBA history, outside of, I believe it was the 92-93 Dallas Mavericks who picked Jim Jackson was the first overall pick.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I can't remember if it was Jamal Mashburn or Jim Jackson. One of the two, one of the Triple J's at the time. That was the only instance of like a team being really bad with a top flight pick.
Yeah.
And because of that, you can make arguments for certain guys, but it's an interesting scenario because in most cases, Rick, when you've had teams with below 12 wins, I'll say it like this, they usually don't have that much talent. They're just really bad teams, but the Pistons have high level guys. I mean, we didn't for most of this entire podcast, we didn't even talk about Jalen Duren during his time. Like, who had a really good game in the win against Toronto. So
yeah,
Pistons are not devoid of talent. It's again, I would make the analogy from a lot of these like K competition shows. It's like it's smoothing around the edges to get the correct level.
I would agree, and the pieces fitting together, and you're right that Duren has really shown some flashes here, I think unsurprisingly, because he's got some ability, but he and everybody else on this roster ought to be basically camping out in the gym all summer, firing up three-pointers 12 hours a day, just to try to get that stroke going, whatever you can do to help get it working better. And this is one of those things where, again, to bring it all the way around, on what you said there about where Detroit would have fit in circa 1997. Who says that inflation doesn't hit pro sports like it hits the economy, right? I mean, like, as far as three-point shooting there, 300-yard games in the NFL historically, 1,000-yard rushing seasons. Like, all these numbers from days gone by, we're finding out don't mean as much now, particularly how much in the NBA your team shoots from three-point land.
Yeah, and it's interesting to obviously chart how the league has changed, and obviously, Kirk Goldsberry of ESPN and I always say arguably the greatest basketball book ever read was Sprawl Ball, which is how the game has so dramatically changed in the late 90s and going into the early 2000s. I'll note too, Rick, I watched one of the old 96 finals games between the Sonics and the Bulls, and just seeing how it's not necessarily that they weren't shooting. They didn't know about like 3-point shooting, right? It was never about that. It's just the pace of the game was just so dramatic.
Well, and that's where, again,
it was dramatically different, period.
Kerr doing what he was doing and coming out of the Phoenix system there, where they were sort of a little bit of a prototype in the mid to later 2000s. So I think part of it was Kerr's own thoughts on this. And again, keep in mind, Kerr was a guy much like, he didn't have Mark Price's overall ability, but was somewhat Price-like as far as his ability to hit the three back in the day. So I think part of it was Kerr intuiting as a strong basketball mind the way that he is, that this pace and space thing could really work, especially the spacing. And part of it was the analytics. It like all came together at that point in time because analytics, as much as they came into sports in MLB, it really came into it in the mid 2010s with the StatCast stuff and really hurt, as we've talked about repeatedly on the show, the aesthetics of the game. The three true outcomes, everybody's doing the uppercut swing, all these things that made baseball more unwatchable to younger generations that already found it unwatchable. In the NBA, that was the predominant thing here. It was predominantly that, hey, three-pointers, you hit enough of these ones, and again, you're going to be, yes, it's more of a risk, but it's one of those things where you hit enough of them, and it's going to pay off for you a majority of the time here. And that's the thing where I have always laughed about this, because you talk about coinciding, that as Carmelo Anthony started to age a bit, it coincided with the whole thing of like, hey, long twos are ineffective. I'm not exactly sure why we needed analytics to tell us that long twos were that long twos were inefficient shots to take, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, as we continue to see the game change and how analytics will be scrutinized by people, the one thing that we will always note too is that in today's NBA, outside of one or two guys, the long two has essentially disappeared, and the reason why it has is that it's an inefficient shot.
Right.
And I think sometimes we hear analysts say, "What about the analytics? Analytics is dumb. Analytics is pointless." Well, analytics is there to help shape opinion and to help shape the overall thought process of how you think about the game. And I think the biggest thing that you have to just learn is that preconceived notions are the hardest things in sports. This happens all the time. We've talked, Rick. Is that we think one thing and then that something else can be true about the same thing at the same time. So you have to just consider that the league eventually figured out the inefficiency, and what has happened is that because of the game that's currently played, people who have played the game previously in a different time, in the early 2000s or like the late 90s or the early 2000s, the analysis that they can provide is not going to be as good because it's very hard to be able to analyze something from being so far out of understanding it at the end of the day.
That is true. That is true. And analytics has given us a lot of great insights across the different sports here, but I continue to think that the leader in the clubhouse for the most embarrassing insight that we needed analytics to tell us was that long twos were ineffective. I mean, that's one of those things where it's like, should we really have needed the computers to tell us that? But I mean, I don't know.
To be honest, we all should have just asked Rick Pitino's Providence teams of the 1980s because they figured that one out really quick.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, watching.
But again, I understand too because at the time it was a different world. I mean, we'll notice too, even though the 3-point line came into the NBA in the early 1980s, we didn't really get a team shooting more than 14 threes a game until those Orlando Magic teams of the mid 1990s.
Oh yeah, and
I mean, it took 14 years to figure out for teams to have consistent enough shooters that could make a lot of threes.
Well,
and then now it took another 10, 15 years to figure out that long twos were nothing. And again, well, the question ultimately, I think, with the league, and I think this to even go back to the Pistons, is that will this losing streak be a note to be like you need to focus more on shooting in terms of potential? It's a fact that I've talked to other analysts about myself in terms of just trying to figure out, hey, if you can't shoot at the college level, you're not going to be able to shoot at the NBA level. So I wonder if there will be a higher push towards finding ready-made three-point shooters in today's NBA from the college level, from the G League. It's going to be very interesting to see how the Pistons react to this situation because it's such an anomaly and such a weird scenario that it's going to shape either the Pistons or the NBA on some level in the future.
That's a great point to bring it around on all the way. Yes, you're absolutely right about it. It will shape the Pistons because, as we have noted, getting more shooting on this roster is the first most urgent point of business for them in this off season and moving forward. And in the NBA, again, you don't want to be like Detroit. Here's how you stay away from it. You don't do the whole thing of like, we'll draft guys. Like, I don't mean to pick on Oscar or Thompson, but it's a thing of like, well, we'll teach them how to shoot at the NBA level. you have to value guys accordingly in the draft, and that's a thing where him and his brother should have been, although part of me says they should have been valued more towards the back end of the lottery, but then again, who would we have shuffled up there in their place? Like, you already had the first couple of guys in there that you knew could potentially score, or would certainly score, like Wemby and Henderson, and potentially Brandon Miller to whatever degree. But again, this is one of those things where, again, shooting is just going to become such a paramount thing, and it has been over the last decade, but the lesson of Detroit is that is going to be emphasized more and more and more, because they're the ultimate cautionary tale of when you don't value it enough, or when you are too overconfident about teaching the guys on your roster to be able to shoot. So, as I knew it would be, an unbelievable conversation, Ben, breaking this all down here, not just what it means for Detroit, but for the rest of the league. Thank you so much for another great one, my friend.
I appreciate it, Rick. Hopefully Detroit does not become the worst team. If not, we'll have to do another podcast.
We may have to revisit on this, definitely, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in to FDH Lounge Mini Episode 1696.